Hey guys, tonight we're diving into one of those Bible moments that sounds simple on paper, but if you were actually there, let's just say, you might not have survived the first 5 minutes. Imagine this. You're camping in the middle of nowhere, the stars are incredible, your kid is finally asleep, and suddenly, boom, God shows up with a very awkward request. Yeah, it's that story, the one where Abraham almost had to do the unthinkable. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, while you're at it, tell me in the comments, what city are you watching from and what time is it right now? I love knowing where in the world you're winding down with me. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The night wind drifted softly from the eastern ridge, gently fluttering the edges of your tent. You had been half reclining on a wool mat, about to take a nap, because let's face it, age has made post-dinner naps not just a temptation, but practically a daily ritual. But tonight, something felt different. You opened your eyes and glanced outside. Ah yes, one of those nights, the sky overflowing with stars. Desert nights were always unnervingly quiet, so still that even the shuffle of an ant on sand could be heard. And then you heard a voice. Not a hallucination, not Sarah calling from inside. It was him. The voice you'd come to know over the years. You knew it was him, without question. After all, who else speaks directly into your thoughts without knocking, especially in the middle of the night? Abraham. You didn't respond immediately. To be honest, you were tired, and before any holy awe or reverence had a chance to kick in, your very first thought was simply, again. You sat up, rubbed your eyes, pulled on your wool cloak. This wasn't your first midnight talk with God. You were used to it by now. He always showed up at odd hours, when you were climbing with the flock, fixing a post, or like tonight, just about to nod off. I'm here, you whispered. He didn't say why he came. He didn't ask, how's the flock? Is the water well full? Did you fix the sheep gate? That wasn't his style. He always got straight to the point. This time, he said, lift your eyes, look at the sky. You obeyed. Your eyes rose slowly, and there it was, the same sky you'd looked at since you were a boy. But tonight, it glimmered differently, like a tapestry freshly stitched by angels. And then he said, your descendants will be like these stars, too many to count. You paused. Honestly, you'd heard this before, at least 3 times. Once when you were 75, again when you left and then on the way into Canaan. You didn't say it aloud, but part of you thought, here we go again, the stars thing. Sure, it sounded poetic, inspiring even. But, have you seen me lately? And Sarah? Let's just say we've been eligible for the senior tent for quite a while now. You glanced across the tent and saw your old jar of honey, one of the few things in life that still waited for you faithfully every morning. Still, you didn't mock him. You respected him far too much for that. But you did offer a gentle suggestion. Lord, you said, you've been promising me a child for years, and here I am still childless. Perhaps my servant Eliezer of Damascus could be the heir. You weren't being rebellious. You were just being realistic. You and Sarah, or even the village healer, had stopped offering hope and just patted you kindly on the back. But he wasn't having it. No, he said firmly, not Eliah, your own son, from your own body. You froze. And then he added something that threw you completely off guard. Come, step outside. You obeyed, stepping into the moonlight. The sand beneath your feet was cool. He pointed up again. Try counting the stars. You tried, and failed. Every time you focused on one section, another dozen stars winked into view. It was overwhelming, infinite, breathtaking. Your descendants, he said, will be just like these. And in that moment, something shifted inside you. These weren't just poetic promises anymore. You believed him. You nodded slowly, surprised even by your own certainty. You murmured, "I believe you." Then he said something that changed everything. "Because you believe me, I count you as righteous." Wait, what? Not because you'd built altars, not because you followed rituals, but just because you believed. That was enough? You returned to the edge of your tent and sat back down. Above you the stars still shimmered. A soft breeze brushed your cheek. You chuckled, not mockingly, just softly, gratefully. The kind of laugh that says, "I don't fully understand what's happening, but for some reason, I feel completely seen." You looked up at the night sky, and for the first time in a long time, you didn't just feel like an old man waiting on an old promise. You felt like a seedling, rooted, stirring, alive. You thought of the future, of children, of people you hadn't met, a whole nation. You didn't know their names or what they would look like, but you believed they were real and they were coming. You closed your eyes gently. There was a stillness in the wind you'd never noticed before, a kind of peace that wasn't loud but complete. This conversation had only just begun. Though you lay in your tent, your body stretched out on the mat and your eyes closed, your thoughts refused to rest. That sentence, "Your descendants will be like the stars," kept echoing through your mind like a wind that never runs out of breath. But strangely, it wasn't the promise that kept you awake. It was the tone in his voice. Because deep inside, you could tell he hadn't come only to speak of children. There was more. You'd heard enough divine pauses, enough God-sized sighs to recognize the silence before something heavy lands. The next morning, you rose early. The sun was just breaking across the desert hills, casting long golden shadows on the sand. You stepped outside the tent and looked toward the east. You weren't sure if he'd come again, but you sensed it. He was near, somewhere in the quiet, hiding in the light. You barely sat down when he arrived. No lightning, no fire, no trumpet sound, just that same presence, like someone quietly tapping you on the shoulder with a breath. "Abraham." You didn't flinch this time. "Well, Alpha, I'm listening," you said, more alert than you'd intended. And then he said it. "I'm going to tell you something," he began. "The outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is great. Their sin is very heavy." Your heart skipped a beat. You'd heard stories about those cities. Travelers often muttered about their excitement, but you knew what that meant. Violence, corruption, greed, twisted celebrations. No shame, no limits. You didn't need prophets to tell you those cities had gone dark long ago. "I'm going down there," he continued, "to see whether their deeds match the cries I've heard. If so, I will destroy them." The word "destroy" landed in your gut like a rock. You didn't speak right away. You were thinking of one man, Lot, your nephew, your blood. You remembered the last time you saw him, parting ways, because your herds had grown too large, your workers too argumentative. He had chosen the greener valley, pitched his tents near the city, and now he lived there. In that city, your throat felt dry. You swallowed and whispered, "Lord." He didn't interrupt. He let the silence wait. If there are good people in that city," you said carefully, "would you still wipe it all away? Will you really sweep away the righteous with the wicked? That doesn't sound like you." Your heart pounded. This was uncharted territory. You had questioned him gently, but clearly. "The judge of all the earth," you added, "shouldn't he do what is just?" He looked at you, not angrily, patiently, even warmly. "If I find 50 righteous people in Sodom," he said, "I will spare the entire city for their sake." You breathed out. But 50, that place, it felt optimistic. You hesitated, then glanced up. Lord, I know I'm just dust and ashes, you said quickly, but what if the number is 5 short of 50? Will you still destroy it over 5 people? He replied without delay, I will not destroy it if I find 45. Okay, that worked. Maybe you tried again. What about 40? I will not do it. 30. No destruction. You were beginning to feel like a child negotiating bedtime with a surprisingly patient parent. 20? I will spare it for 20. You took a deep breath. One more try. Please don't be angry, you said, your voice barely above a whisper. What if there are only 10? The wind paused. The desert hushed. Even the camel behind your tent stopped chewing. For the sake of 10, he said, I will not destroy it. You stood there, mouth slightly open, trying to understand what had just happened. He didn't argue. He didn't rebuke. He had listened. You had never felt this before. This wasn't a negotiation. It wasn't a courtroom drama. It was something else. It was relationship. You weren't wrestling with him. You were walking with him, like friends do, like someone who is close enough to ask hard questions and still be embraced. He looked at you one more time, nodded slightly, and turned away, walking into the quiet, leaving the conversation suspended like morning dew. You stayed outside the tent, watching the wind ripple through the sand. The light had changed, but you hadn't moved. You didn't know what would happen next. You didn't know what he would do, but you knew one thing. You had spoken, and he had heard you. The morning passed slowly. You remained by the entrance of your tent, staring out toward the far edge of the hills, where the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah sat, out of sight, yet fully present in your thoughts. You weren't sure if it was worry, hope, or something in between, but your chest felt tight, as though your heart had been carefully wrapped in tension. Sarah brought you a small piece of flatbread. You didn't eat it. She didn't ask questions. She just sat beside you for a while, looking in the same direction. The hours passed. The heat of the day came and settled into the sand, and still nothing changed. No word from him, no signs in the sky, no sudden revelations, just wind, sun, and the ever-present weight of waiting. You weren't used to this part. The conversations with him always felt so vivid, so full of presence and fire. But the silence afterward, that was the hard part, like trying to breathe in a room where the oxygen has thinned. You glanced again at the horizon. You couldn't help but wonder, were there even 10 righteous people in that city? You'd lived long enough to know people. Some hide their light well, but it's there. Maybe a humble baker, maybe a shepherd who always tells the truth, maybe a mother who prays at night for her children's safety. It didn't need to be a temple full of saints, just 10 honest souls. But was that too much to ask? You wanted to believe it. You really did. A voice inside you kept repeating, 10 is enough. He said so. That's all it takes. But another voice, the one that grew from realism and age, whispered, you've seen that city. You know what goes on there. Don't get your hopes up. You sighed. Sarah had gone back inside. You stayed outside, letting the sun slowly crawl up your robe. The heat helped distract you from the ache in your chest. Then, from a distance, you saw movement. 2 figures, faint at first, were walking toward the hills. They looked human, but something about the way they moved made your skin prickle. And then, it hit you. You'd seen them before. 2 of the 3 visitors who had come to your tent not long ago. The ones who'd spoken of Sarah having a son. The ones who didn't eat like regular men. The ones who shimmered ever so slightly when the light hit them right. They were headed to Sodom. You rose to your feet. Not to follow, not to interfere, just to watch. You didn't know exactly what they would do, but you knew their presence wasn't ordinary. They moved with purpose, with judgment, in their wake, And though you couldn't hear their voices from this distance, your heart felt what they carried. Justice. It wasn't loud or vengeful. It didn't come screaming, but it was steady, quiet, heavy. You felt it in your bones. You lowered yourself back to the ground and rested your head in your hands. There was nothing more to say, nothing left to argue. You had already pleaded your case, lowered the number as far as it would go. Now, it was up to the city, up to whatever goodness might still be left in its alleys and homes, up to 10, just 10. You whispered one last thought toward the wind. Please, let there be 10. The night came fast. It always did in the desert. One moment, you were squinting at sunlight, and the next, shadows stretched like spilled ink across the sand. The sky turned from gold to violet to deep black, scattered with stars, familiar companions by now. But tonight, the stars weren't comforting. You stayed awake, not because of the heat or the wind or the creaking of your tent ropes. You stayed awake because your thoughts wouldn't sit still. Your mind was in a city miles away, its gates, its streets, its people. What were they doing? Did they feel it too? The tension in the air, the calm before something breaks. You imagined Lot at home, maybe sitting at his table, unaware that something divine and irreversible was approaching, or maybe not entirely unaware. After all, he'd lived there long enough to know that the place was wrong. You had always wondered why he stayed. You closed your eyes and tried to sleep, but it didn't come. The wind picked up, tugging at the sides of the tent. Somewhere in the distance, a jackal howled. The sky was full of stars, but they no longer felt like a promise. They felt like a question. And then, before morning broke, you saw it. Far on the horizon, where the land dropped low and the cities nestled in their sin, something changed. A glow. Faint at first. Orange. Unnatural. Your breath caught. You sat up, stepped outside your tent. The sand was cool under your feet, but your chest burned. The glow intensified. It wasn't sunrise. You knew that light. You'd seen it once before, long ago, when a field burned out of nowhere and a voice called your name from the flames. But this wasn't a calling. This was a verdict. You stood there, barefoot in the dark, watching the sky turn sickly red over the valley. It spread slowly, not like fire that licks and dances, but like judgment, measured, patient, terrifying in its stillness. You covered your mouth. You didn't speak. What words could you possibly offer now? The time for questions had passed. The time for counting was over. Your heart broke, not just for Lot, though you thought of him constantly, but for all the people you didn't know, the ones who laughed yesterday and never knew it was their last sunset, the ones who might have prayed once and then gave up, the children, the mothers, the strangers. You remembered your words. If only there are 10. Were there not even that? You didn't blame him, not now. He had listened. He had allowed you to speak. He had walked with you longer than you deserved. He had stayed patient while you bargained, step by step. But he had also seen clearly. You, in your hope, had believed there might be 10. He, in his justice, had known there were not. You lowered your head, not out of anger, out of grief. Grief that felt holy, heavy, like a sorrow that didn't ask for comfort, just to be held in silence. And so you stood there, in that silence, wrapped in the final glow of a city no longer standing. The days that followed were strangely quiet. No thunder, no shaking ground, just stillness, as if the earth itself had held its breath and decided to keep holding it. You went about your days, feeding the animals, checking on your herds, listening for distant news. Nothing came, no messengers from the valley, no stories of survivors, only the wind, whispering across dry rocks. You didn't ask questions. What could you ask? You already knew the answer. The sky had spoken, and the city was gone. Final. Absolute. Sarah didn't speak of it either, but you caught her sometimes, pausing longer at the fire, staring off into the distance, hands still in the flour, unmoving. She had known Lot too. She'd sewn clothes for his wife once, long before the city took them all in. She never said it, but you could see it in her. She had hoped for those 10 too. Then one morning, the silence broke. From the south, far in the distance, a single figure stumbled over the ridge. You squinted against the sun. Was it? It was. Lot. He looked smaller, older, scorched by more than fire. His clothes were torn, his face sunburned, his eyes lost. He walked like a man carrying ghosts. You didn't run to him. You walked. 2 old men, heavy with memory, met under a fig tree. He collapsed into your arms, and still, neither of you said anything at first. Words felt too small. Eventually, over water and bread, he told you what little he could. The angels, the warning, the fire, his wife's hesitation, her turning, the pillar of salt. You tried not to picture it. You failed. He had made it out with his daughters, barely. His home, his neighbors, his whole life, ash. You sat together until the sun sank. No talk of theology, no debates about justice, just 2 men sitting in what was left. When he slept that night, you watched him. He trembled, even in dreams. And you, still wide awake, looked up once again at the stars. But this time, you didn't count them. You just let them be. Each one a reminder of mercy attempted, of justice rendered, of stories that sometimes end before they feel finished, of what it means to hope, and what it means to grieve when hope isn't enough. Time moved on, but something inside you didn't. Days came and went. Sheep were fed, wells were drawn, new cracks appeared on the clay pots. Life resumed, but not quite the same. You carried something now. Not bitterness, not regret, but a kind of solemn awareness, like a scar on the soul that doesn't hurt, but never really fades. You stopped asking why. You knew you couldn't understand everything. That wasn't your role. You were a man of dust and breath, not thunder and fire. But you still listened. You still watched. You still wondered, even if you didn't say it out loud. Then one afternoon, when the heat made even the lizards lazy, you saw him again. Not as a voice this time. He came in form, light wrapped in something that looked like a man. He didn't need to knock. He was just there, beside the oak, in the breeze that somehow didn't stir the leaves. You rose quietly. Your knees creaked, your back ached, but your heart beat faster than it had in days. He looked at you, and for a moment, neither of you spoke. Then he said, "It's time." You didn't ask for what, because deep down, you already knew. The promise, the impossible one, the one about Sarah, the one you laughed at once, back when laughing still came easy. She will bear a son. You opened your mouth, closed it, opened it again. She's old, you finally said. I'm older. He didn't smile or frown. He just said, "Is anything too hard for me?" And you remembered. Yes, that's what he does. The unthinkable, the unreasonable, the beyond. You stood in silence, letting the breeze pass between you. He continued, "In a year the child will be born." That night, you told Sarah again. She stared at you like you had a pebble in your brain. Now, she asked. Soon, you said. She didn't laugh this time. She didn't cry either. She just nodded once, then sat quietly by the fire, watching the flames like they held the future in them. You couldn't sleep. Not from fear this time or grief, but anticipation. And underneath that, something more fragile, hope. Real hope. The kind you had to relearn after watching cities fall and promises hang in the air for years. You whispered to the stars, not to count them this time, but to tell them,
I'm still here, and I still believe.
The days became softer after that. It wasn't that the sun was any less harsh or the sand any less dry, but something had shifted in your chest. There was warmth now, a quiet, fragile flame that refused to go out. Sarah changed too. She didn't say much, but you noticed. Her steps were lighter. Her eyes held something between suspicion and wonder. She stopped avoiding the word child in conversations, and one day, while kneading dough, she hummed. You hadn't heard her hum in years. You didn't say anything about it. You just let it happen, like watching a flower grow out of rock. And then it happened. One morning, she woke up with her hand on her belly, her brow furrowed in silence. You asked if she was all right, and she just stared at you for a long time, as if deciding whether to say what she was thinking. Then she nodded, once, slowly. Your heart skipped. You didn't jump, you didn't shout, you simply sat beside her, not knowing what to do with your hands. So you held hers. The weeks that followed passed in a blur of preparation. You found yourself counting sheep, twice triple-checking tent seams, organizing things that didn't need organizing. She laughed at you. Yes, she laughed. Not the bitter kind or the disbelieving kind from before. This one was real. Soft, surprised, slightly amused at how nervous you looked. You're worse than a first-time shepherd, she teased. You smiled. You'd take that. As her belly grew, so did your quiet awe. Not fear, not even disbelief, just wonder. Sometimes you'd wake in the middle of the night and gently reach out to feel her breathing, not to check, but to remember this was real, that after everything, dust, fire, cities lost, promises delayed, life had returned. It had chosen your tent, your barren wife, your old tired self. It had come quietly, not with thunder, but with heartbeat. One evening, you sat outside under the stars again, but this time, you weren't asking questions. You were giving thanks, not out loud, not formally, just with your whole body, your stillness, your breath, the way you looked at the sky, like it was made of something more than fire and gas, like it was full of memory. You didn't know what the child would be like, who he would become, what kind of laughter he'd bring, but you knew this. He would be named Isaac, and even in the naming, you would remember how much joy can follow sorrow. The day came quietly. There was no trumpet, no dramatic storm, no voice booming from the sky, just the sound of Sarah breathing, steady and slow, and your own heartbeat racing faster than it had in years. You were outside, pacing, not because you didn't want to be there, but because you didn't know how to be there. You felt like a man who had built altars and parted from kings, but now stood completely helpless in the face of childbirth. Inside the tent, women whispered, moved quickly, boiled water, and Sarah, she was doing what you once believed was impossible. You whispered prayers, not the fancy kind, not the kind you recited during rituals. These were clumsy, half sentences, muttered under your breath like a man talking to the wind. You didn't ask for a miracle. That part had already come. You just asked for strength, for peace, for mercy. And then a cry, a sound like none you'd ever heard before. High-pitched, tiny, furious. You froze. One of the women lifted the flap and called your name. You didn't move at first. You stared at the tent like it was a mountain, like stepping through that opening would change the entire world. And it did. You stepped inside. There she was, Sarah, exhausted, glowing, half laughing and half crying, and in her arms, the promise, no longer words, no longer stars, flesh, breath, wrinkled skin, and flailing limbs, a life. Your knees gave out, and you knelt beside them. You didn't speak, you just watched him. He yawned, and suddenly you remembered every desert night, every long wait, every time you thought the story had ended, only to realize it hadn't even begun. You touched his tiny fingers. He wrapped them around yours, like he'd been waiting to meet you forever. Sarah looked at you and whispered, "Isaac." You smiled. A laugh, not loud, but full, rose from somewhere deep. It felt like something cracked open in your chest, and light came pouring out. So this is what joy feels like when it's delayed but not denied. You leaned over and kissed your wife's forehead. She closed her eyes, tears still on her cheeks. You whispered to the child, "Welcome, we've been waiting." Outside, the sun rose just a little brighter. Or maybe you were just seeing it differently now. Isaac grew, not in great leaps, not all at once, but steadily, like roots finding their way through soil, quiet and unseen, yet certain. Each day he added something new, a sound, a smile, a wobbling step. And you watched him like a man watching a miracle grow legs and run around the tent. Sometimes you just sat nearby and listened, the way he laughed at goats, the way he tried to mimic Sarah's humming, the way he called you Abba, like it was the only word that mattered. You never tired of hearing it. And Sarah, she bloomed. Motherhood suited her in a way you'd never imagined. She was softer now, though still fierce. She defended Isaac like a lioness, and at the same time kissed his cheeks like she was afraid he'd vanish. You often caught her staring at him, as if still trying to believe he was real. But joy doesn't always come alone. One afternoon, while Isaac was playing with stones, Sarah's gaze shifted. You followed her eyes and saw them, Hagar and Ishmael. You had almost forgotten what tension felt like. Hagar was walking carefully, aware she was no longer part of the center. Ishmael, now a teenager, was laughing loud, sharp, teasing. At first, you didn't notice the difference. Boys laugh, boys tease. But Sarah did. Her whole body stiffened. She walked over, her pace slow, controlled, but her eyes were fire. When she returned, she said one sentence, "Send them away." You blinked. What? They won't share the inheritance with my son. You opened your mouth, closed it, opened it again.
They're family, you said.
They're a threat, she replied. You didn't want to decide. You didn't want to lose anyone. You had already said goodbye to too many people in one lifetime. So that night, you prayed, hard, and the voice came not as thunder, but as calm reassurance. Do what Sarah says. You didn't sleep. At dawn, you packed bread and water, hands trembling. You gave them to Hagar, looked her in the eyes, and couldn't find words. She didn't cry. She just took Ishmael's hand and walked away. You watched until they became shadows on the sand. And then, with Isaac still sleeping beside Sarah, you sat alone. The joy was still there, but now it lived beside something else. A grief you chose, and a peace that didn't come easy. The years passed, but you didn't notice them the way you used to. Time, once a burden, had softened. It no longer mocked you with delay. It walked beside you, step by step, like an old friend who had finally learned patience. Isaac grew into a boy with curious eyes and a laugh that came easily. He asked too many questions, chased goats, ran faster than you could now even dream of running. You adored him. Every wrinkle on your face, every ache in your bones, felt worth it just to see him laugh. But then, one morning, before the sun had fully risen, he came again. Not in a whirlwind, not in a fire, just there, present, like the silence before rain. And this time, he didn't begin with a greeting. He said, "Abraham." You answered, without hesitation, "Here I am." And then he said words you never expected, words that burned and froze you all at once. "Take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and offer him to me as a burnt offering."
You didn't move. You didn't speak.
Time itself seemed to pause. Surely you had misheard. Surely he meant something else. But deep inside, you knew. You knew that voice, that steadiness, that piercing clarity. It never lied, never joked. You stood. You didn't cry. You didn't scream. You just moved. You gathered wood, took a knife, saddled a donkey, woke Isaac. You told Sarah you were going to worship, that you'd be back. She didn't ask questions. She trusted you now, more than ever. As you and the boy walked toward the distant mountain, your heart beat with every step, not loudly, not wildly, just deliberately. And Isaac, he walked beside you, asking, "Father, where is the lamb?" And you answered, "God will provide." Because if you didn't say it, your heart might have broken right there on the trail. At the foot of the mountain, you told the servants to wait. "We will go up," you said, "and we will come back." Not I. We. You climbed. Every step was a war. Your feet obeyed, but your soul trembled. And when you reached the place, you built the altar, just like old times. But this wasn't like old times. This was your son, and as he lay down, trusting you, your hands tied him with cords that shook, not because he resisted, he didn't, but because you did. You raised the knife, the wind stopped. And then, "Abraham," you froze. "Here I am. Do not lay a hand on the boy." You exhaled for the first time in what felt like eternity, and then you saw it. A ram, caught in the thicket. You wept. You untied Isaac, pulled him into your arms, and wept like a man finally released from holding his breath too long. You called the place Yahweh Yireh, the Lord will provide. And he did. Not just the ram, but the moment, the mercy, the choice not to take, but to teach, not to demand, but to reveal. That love requires surrender. And faith is not blind obedience. It is walking up the mountain, not knowing what waits, but believing God is already there. The descent from the mountain was slower than the climb, not because your legs were weaker, though they were, but because your heart was heavier, not with sorrow, with awe. Isaac walked beside you in silence, glancing at you now and then, as if still unsure whether what had just happened was real. You didn't try to explain. How could you? How do you explain obedience that almost broke you, or mercy that came just in time, or the look in your son's eyes when you raised a knife but gave him back his life? Some stories are too holy for words. So you walked together, one foot after the other. When you returned to the camp, Sarah came running, half laughing, half sobbing. She pulled Isaac to her chest, as if trying to fuse him back into her body. You watched them with gratitude and guilt. But she didn't ask questions. Not then. Later, when Isaac had fallen asleep with dirt still on his feet, she sat beside you by the fire. "What happened?" she asked. You didn't answer at first. You stared into the flames as if they could say it for you. Then you whispered, "He asked for everything. And I gave everything." She nodded, not in anger, not in understanding either, but in that deep way only people who've survived impossible things can nod. You didn't talk much after that. Some days, you just watched Isaac play and wondered why God had asked. Other days, you wondered why he hadn't taken him. But slowly, the weight lifted. You began to see the world again, not through the lens of sacrifice, but of restoration. You started to laugh more, not just because of Isaac, though he helped, but because your heart had room again. You taught Isaac how to build an altar, how to pitch a tent, how to read the wind and find the stars. And one night, as you both sat under the sky, he asked, "Why did God test you?" You didn't say, "I don't know." You said, "Because he knew I wouldn't fail." Isaac nodded, then looked up at the stars. And you didn't count them. You simply watched him count and marveled at how some promises take years, pain, and mountains, but still, somehow, come true. The older you grew, the quieter life became. Not empty, just still. The days no longer rushed. They stretched gently, like soft linen laid out in the sun. Isaac ran less, talked more, you sat more, spoke less. You had become a man who measured time not by sunrises, but by moments of stillness. One morning, Sarah didn't rise with you. She had slept deeply the night before, hand curled gently beneath her cheek. You whispered her name once, then again. She didn't answer. You touched her face, still warm, but unmoving. Your breath caught, and suddenly a silence fell over your tent. Not the comforting kind, but the kind that hollows out the room. You didn't cry, not at first. You just sat beside her, remembering the years, the laughter, the fights, the long walks, the impossible waiting, the first time she hummed again, the last time she said your name. Isaac came in quietly and sat beside you. He didn't speak either. Grief, in that moment, was a shared language. You buried her in a cave, not just any cave, but one you insisted on buying, even though the locals offered it for free, because she deserved a resting place that cost something, a place that said she was worth it. And after you laid her to rest, you sat by that cave for days. No grand speeches, no new altars, just silence. Isaac brought you food. Sometimes he sat, sometimes he left, sometimes he asked questions you couldn't answer. Do you think she was proud of me? You said she still is. And in saying it, you realized you still spoke of her in the present, because love doesn't end when breath does. You eventually left the cave, but not your memories. You started looking toward Isaac's future. He was a man now, though you still saw the boy. You worried for him, not because he was weak, but because he was good. And good men need love. So you sent your servant, your oldest, most trusted, to find Isaac a wife. You didn't choose the girl. You trusted the journey. When your servant returned with Rebecca, you watched Isaac's eyes light up in a way that reminded you of yourself long ago when Sarah still teased you about your camel-walking posture. They stood beside each other, uncertain but hopeful. You didn't say much. You just nodded and whispered to the sky. She'll help him carry the promise. The house felt different with Rebecca in it. Not louder, not busier, just alive in a new way. You watched her move with quiet strength, carrying water, tending animals, kneading dough while humming softly. She was like Sarah in some ways, but not in others, and that was good. Isaac loved her. You could see it in the way he listened, really listened, when she spoke. You could see it in the way he smiled without realizing how his shoulders rested lighter when she was near. Sometimes, when they laughed together, you let yourself believe the promise was safe now. It was no longer just in your hands. You found yourself stepping back more often, letting Isaac lead the prayers, letting Rebecca run the tent, letting the future arrive without needing to control it. And then one evening, as the sky turned amber, Isaac came to you with worry in his eyes. "She's having twins," he said. You blinked. "Two?" you asked, half smiling. He nodded. "She says they're fighting inside her." You raised an eyebrow. "Siblings," you muttered, "always start early." But something about his face told you this was more than that. Later, you found Rebecca sitting by herself, staring at the hills, her hands on her belly, not afraid, but listening. She looked at you and said, "It feels like they're already choosing sides." You didn't know what that meant. Neither did she. But soon the message came, clear as day, deep as thunder in your bones. Two nations are in your womb. And one will be stronger. The older will serve the younger. You said nothing, because what could you say? You knew prophecy. You also knew the pain that usually walked beside it. When the boys were born, Esau, red and wild like the desert sun, and Jacob, quiet but gripping his brother's heel, you looked at them and wondered, will they love each other? Will they tear each other apart? You didn't have the answers. You only had history. And hope. So you did what you always did. You told them stories. You told them about stars and promises, about mountains and rams, about wells and strangers and a woman who laughed when she shouldn't have, and a God who waited until the last second to show mercy. You told them who they came from. You told them who they could become, and you prayed that they would one day choose each other instead of choosing sides. You were old, not just in years, but in memories. You carried more stories than your bones could hold. Every scar, every wrinkle, every slow breath was a chapter, and your life long, uneven, messy, beautiful, was nearing its final page. You knew it, and you were okay. Isaac sat with you more now, not as a boy seeking approval, but as a man seeking wisdom. He asked questions with quiet reverence, about God, about choices, about legacy. Sometimes you answered with stories, sometimes with silence, because you had learned some answers only come with time, and some don't come at all. One morning, you felt it. The way your hand trembled slightly when you poured water. The way your breath caught, just walking from one tent post to another. The way your eyes lingered too long on the sky, as if trying to memorize its exact shade. You didn't tell anyone. Not yet. But you started walking more slowly, intentionally. You began blessing your servants, giving things away, writing your goodbyes without using ink. One night, Isaac came to you with a quiet question. Did you ever regret it? You looked at him, at the face that once belonged to a promise, now grown into a man. No, you said, not once. No. He nodded, but he didn't leave. He waited. So you added, but I was scared, a lot. He smiled, almost in relief. I thought I was the only one. You chuckled. The only one scared? Son, the whole world is scared. Even the stars tremble sometimes. That's why we need promises. He sat beside you in silence for a long time. You both just watched the fire crackle. And eventually, you said, the hardest thing I ever did wasn't walking up that mountain. It was choosing to keep walking after. Isaac didn't speak. He just reached for your hand. You squeezed it. Not tightly, just enough to say, I'm still here. Because you were. But you knew you wouldn't be forever. So that night, when you laid down to sleep, you prayed the same prayer you had whispered for years. Let my story remind them that faith doesn't mean perfection. It means persistence. You closed your eyes, not out of weariness, but out of peace. You didn't wake up the next morning, but no one panicked. The tent was still. The sun had risen. The sheep grazed like always. Only your breath was missing. Isaac found you, eyes closed, hands resting on your chest, face calm like someone who had just finished telling their last story and finally fell asleep. He didn't weep, not at first. He just sat there beside you. Rebecca joined him, then your old servant, then the grandchildren, and one by one, your tent filled with silence, the kind that feels like respect. They buried you next to Sarah, in the same cave you bought all those years ago. The land still smelled like dry grass and sun-warmed stones. Isaac gave the eulogy. No grand speech, no dramatic gestures. He just said, "He taught me how to walk up mountains and how to walk back down." Then he paused, and that pause, like the one before thunder, said more than 1,000 words. Afterward, Rebecca lit a small oil lamp and placed it near your grave. Its flame flickered in the wind, but didn't go out. And that's how they remembered you. Not as perfect, but as steady. Not as fearless, but as faithful. You were the friend of God, the one who bargained with him for cities, the one who laughed, doubted, trusted, stumbled, obeyed, questioned, believed, the man who left everything just to follow a voice, the voice that promised stars and gave you sand and breath and a child and a covenant that outlived your own bones. Centuries from now, people would whisper your name in stories told by firelight. They teach their children that you weren't great because you were strong. You were great because you kept walking, even when the road made no sense, even when the promise was only a whisper. And somewhere beyond time, beyond tents and stars and altars, your voice joins a chorus. Not because it was loud, but because it was faithful. So now, as you lay tucked beneath your blanket, eyes heavy, heart quiet, you've walked alongside Abraham from tents to mountaintops, from laughter to trembling prayers. And maybe, like him, you've doubted, you've waited, you've feared, but you also kept walking. That's what faith often looks like, not thunder or miracles, but slow steps in the dark, trusting the next will land somewhere safe. Abraham's story isn't about perfection. It's about persistence. It's about getting up the next day, even when the promise still feels far. So sleep now, traveler. Let your breath steady like evening wind across desert hills. And remember, you too carry stars inside you. Good night.